I don't think growing up I experienced, certainly until I was much older, antisemitism. I don't think I even knew what it was.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Georgina Downer, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our third Afternoon Light Live for 2026. Well, since the October 7th Hamas attacks on Israel, we have seen a deep development here in Australia and across many Western democracies, this sharp and very visible rise of anti-Semitism. Here in Australia, Jewish schools have required heightened security. Synagogues have not only been vandalised but firebombed. Here on university campuses, such as at Melbourne University, where I am today, both Jewish students and academics have reported intimidation and harassment. Beyond the campuses, we've seen Jewish creatives and academics doxxed with their names, their workplaces and personal details circulated online, a tactic that's left many of them fearing for their safety. But nothing, absolutely nothing, brought home the reality of rising anti-Semitism more starkly than the terrorist attack at Bondi Beach on the 14th of December last year. Gunmen opened fire on the Hanukkah by the Sea celebration and 15 people were murdered and dozens more injured. This deliberately targeted our Jewish community. The horror of that night shocked our nation and forced Australians to confront a very difficult reality, that anti-Semitism had re-emerged so visibly in a country that once prided itself on being a refuge for Jewish after the Holocaust. Now, after the Second World War, Australia welcomed thousands of Jewish refugees fleeing the devastation of Europe. Many had arrived during the Menzies era from 1949, and for them this country became what some have called Golden Land, a place of safety, opportunity and belonging. So the question for us today is not only what has changed, but how we ensure that Australia remains that country, that golden land. These are questions about identity, belonging, tolerance, pluralism, and the resilience of our liberal democracy. Now, they're deeply personal questions for our guest today, Michael Gawenda. Michael is an award-winning journalist and former editor-in-chief of The Age. He's the only Jewish editor-in-chief of that newspaper in its history. Now, as always with our Afternoon Light Lives, I'll have 30 minutes of discussion with our guest, followed by 30 minutes of live Q&A. But without further ado, thank you very much, Michael Gawenda, for joining me on Afternoon Light.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here, not least on the University of Melbourne campus. I think it's incredibly important to have these discussions here and important that our university campus hosts people from all parts of Australian life and from all different perspectives.
Can I just say, I didn't go to Melbourne, but
yes,
I set up the Centre for Advancing Journalism here
yes.
in 2007. It didn't have a journalism program, Melbourne. I developed with others the master's course that is still going, and I was the inaugural director of that centre. So I've got a history with Melbourne University that is not all that far distant in the past.
No, not at all. Oh, it's a fabulous centre and we've had academics from there participating in a lot of our programs. So thank you for setting that up. But we will go back to the dim, distant past, if you don't mind. Your family came to Australia in 1950 as DPs, displaced people, at the very, very beginning of the Menzies era. You were just 3 years old, so I won't assume that you remember in detail how your family...
I don't remember anything.
No.
I was less than 3, actually. I was 2.5.
But what's your perception of how families like yours were received during that era? What sort of what was the Australian attitude to the DPs and others coming from Europe?
I mean, you've got to remember that there was many tens of thousands of people from all over the world, Europe in particular. I mean, there were, people from Yugoslavia, people from Italy, people from Greece. So we felt like we were part of this transformation of Australia that was taking place. Hundreds of thousands of us were being brought in. Most of us, certainly my family, knew nothing about Australia. We came to Australia because my father had a cousin here who told it was a good place to come. And the fact is that Australia was the most welcoming of the countries of people that were stuck in DP camps. There were actually immigration officials that came to those camps to take the names of people that wanted to come to Australia. They were investigated. I don't know. I think the investigation was really not much. But my father was granted a visa. The whole family were granted the right to come to Australia. And he knew nothing, we knew nothing, they knew nothing about the place, except that it was far away from Europe, and they wanted to get away as far away as they could from Europe. They'd been through terrible times. And we arrived in Australia, and I think that from the start, my memory is, maybe it's a bit rosy, but my memory was that my parents quickly, and they were not young, they were already, my father would have been 50, my mother would have been 40. So I was a late baby. I had sisters who were 20 years older than me, but they got into this place from the start. They were determined, certainly my father, to learn English quickly. He was very active in Australian politics. And I mean, he wasn't ever going to be, but he was active. He was a supporter of the Labor Party. He was a democratic socialist. And he loved the place sort of from the start. All his life he was a working man. So he loved the trade unions that he was involved with. I've got to say that he wasn't a great fan of Menzies. You've got to be honest about
Menzies
that.
didn't get his vote.
I don't think Menzies did get his vote, but Australia got his vote.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't hate Menzies. I mean, he thought the political system here was beyond belief good.
Yeah.
I mean, there was no violence, there was no threats of violence. And the Jews really, Australia was home to, by 1955, the greatest, in percentage terms, in terms of population, the greatest number of Holocaust survivors came here, only second to Israel, where the number was greater.
Yeah.
And they built an incredible community here. Institutions, schools, cultural institutions, synagogues. Life for the Jews of Australia, certainly of Melbourne, was incredibly rich. And I grew up in a way in that environment. I didn't go to Jewish schools. There was only one Jewish school at that time. And my father wouldn't have wanted me to go to a Jewish school. But when I started school, I couldn't speak English.
So your family was Polish?
Yes, they spoke Yiddish.
Yeah.
And I grew up in Yiddish until I went to school.
Yeah.
But at school, there were other people who couldn't speak English. There were Greek kids and Italian kids and Yugoslav kids and kids from all over the place that all also couldn't speak English. And we were all, I don't want to say a terrible word, but I will, wogs. And I thought, we're all wogs. I mean, Jews weren't differentiated from
the
Italians
or
the Greeks.
Yeah.
We were all wogs. Yeah. And I loved school. I loved my friends. I don't think growing up I experienced, certainly until I was much older, antisemitism. I don't think I even knew what it was.
Which is incredible to think your parents had experienced the worst of antisemitism through the Holocaust, fleeing Poland to Siberia, I think, and then, of course, ending up in Austria in a DP camp. But you, as a young boy growing up in suburban Melbourne,
I didn't
just
feel
wasn't your reality.
No.
So you've written a memoir, My Life as a Jew, and something you write about is that you didn't necessarily grow up religious. You were quite a secular person.
Yes, I was a secular person.
I mean, you were an internationalist, a man of the left.
I was a man of the left. I wasn't a Zionist. That's the truth.
Yeah.
Certainly when I was a kid, I wasn't a Zionist. But the sort of non-Zionist I was, my family supported Israel, supported its right to exist. My parents sent food to family that they had in Israel in the 50s. I remember photographs of the families in Tel Aviv standing in front of a packet of food that they had got from us. So there was no question of not supporting Israel's existence.
So being a Zionist in the 1950s, what made it different to being a Zionist in 2026?
Well, Zionist in the 1950s meant not just that you supported the existence of the state, but that your philosophy was that all Jews should go and live in Israel. Right. Making aliyah, which is a word for going up, was the basic ideology of Zionists, that the future of the Jewish people was in Israel. Now, where I grew up, we never believed that. We believed, yes, Israel existed and was important, but Jews were people of the world. I was an Australian. Australia was my home. Jews were the perfect example. Noel Pearson once said this, of what it meant to be an Australian of a particular ethnic or religious background.
So how has your sense of Jewish identity changed throughout your life?
Well, most of my life, I had a commitment that Jews were a people of the world and that Jews of all types, Judaism, Jewishness was not a religion. It was not even an ethnicity. It was kind of a history connecting these people that made it impossible to, and different periods of history proved this, made it impossible to discard your Jewishness. Even when Jews wanted to, anti-Semites didn't allow them to do that. I mean, Hitler and the Nazis defined Jews as racial, in the sense that if you had a grandfather who was Jewish, you were Jewish, even though there were generations of Jews who had converted and were actually not Jews at all. They were Catholics or Protestants. You know, people don't know this, but in the Warsaw Ghetto, there were 3 churches.
Right.
And they were churches for people who considered themselves Christians, but the Nazis considered Jews. So I do believe there's such a thing as Jewish peoplehood and Jewish people, defined by history, connection, family, all those things. But of course, the meaning of Zionism over time has changed. It has come to be defined not by Jews, but by enemies of Jews, so that it has become, well, we know this, and some of the leading scholars of post-colonialism are Australian, that Zionism became a post-colonial, a colonialist ideology, a racist ideology, an ideology that denies the right of the indigenous people of Palestine, of their rights and freedoms, and that Zionism, Israel, is a colonialist society.
Yeah.
You know, some of the leading scholars of that are here. Some of them are at Melbourne University.
Yeah.
And so Zionism became defined not by Jews, but by other people as something other than what Jews had considered it to be for more than 100 years. Suddenly, and me too, suddenly what I thought was Zionism became something else altogether. And I wrote about this, and this is especially true for people like me, Jews that consider themselves on the left. Suddenly I found that the sort of Jew of the left that I was and had been all my life and had been accepted in the Labor Party, and even though I was never a member of the Labor Party because I was a journalist, and I think I could conduct my journalism without being prejudiced. But the fact is, the people that I thought were of the same views as me on the left suddenly said that I was not on the left. I was actually a Zionist, a supporter of colonialism, of racism, and that I was more on the right. I was part of almost a neo-Nazi movement that supported, fascist countries. Israel had become a kind of semi-fascist country, supported by the right. Netanyahu it became a kind of monster, really. And so, for me, while I seriously disagreed with a lot of government policy in Israel, and Netanyahu was not a hero of mine, but the idea that suddenly Israel was the greatest font of all evil in the world on the left amongst people that I knew that had never expressed these views to me, and that happened before October the 7th. It's in my book. I found myself in this position where people that I thought were my friends were not talking to me anymore, that we had such fundamental difference of views about what it meant to be a Zionist, which I never thought I was, but what it meant to be a Jew made it impossible for me. And, of course, post-October the 7th, that became,
Yeah, right out front and centre of everyday Australian experience.
And the denial by sections of the left, and I have to say by sections of the government, that this anti-Zionism virus had anything to do with Jew hatred is ridiculous. It's mad. It's kind of like, it's a conspiracy theory. It's like Jews are concocting this. The Zionist lobby is concocting this idea of anti-Semitism to use it as a weapon against those who oppose Israel.
Michael, it's really, I think, important to look at how the left has treated Israel over its entire history. I mean, basically your lifetime.
Yes.
Doc Everett, a Labor leader, a real hero of the Labor Party in terms of his support for the founding of the United Nations. He is instrumental in the creation of the State of Israel. There is bipartisan support over the decades through the Menzies era, really until you get to Whitlam for Israel. And Whitlam is a bit of an aberration, really, because once we pass Whitlam, the Labor side renews support for Israel, with Bob Hawke being a staunch supporter of Israel. But then at the UN, a body that had been there at the birth of Israel in the late 1940s, to see the UN discussions become really anti-Israel. There's some statistic about the General Assembly resolution. Some vast proportion of them are in condemnation of Israel. This is an institution, an international institution that has a real bias against Israel. But how have you seen over the course of your lifetime that transformation of the cause of Israel, that was a cause that left-wing leaders did celebrate and support, come to be something that the global left and a lot of the global south are completely opposed to?
Remember that the UN passed a resolution that Zionism is racism in 1975.
Yeah.
And that resolution was basically organised by the Soviet Union and by its supporters in the Arab world. You've got to remember that in 1995, the Soviet Union still had huge influence in the Middle East. But you know, thinking back now, it is amazing to think that Bill Hayden, who was on the left in the Labor Party, he organised the Labor Party and the government to support resolutions in the Australian Parliament, and we were amongst the first to do that, to rescind that resolution.
Right.
This was organised by Bill Hayden. And in America, they recognised, the Democrats in America actually said so. The Australians had inspired us to pass similar resolutions in America. Now, can you imagine any Labor politician now organising to overturn a resolution that was critical of Israel or Zionism? It's impossible to imagine.
Yeah.
I can't imagine it. Bob Hawke, they had this enormous love for Israel. It's true. And he loved particular politicians. I mean, you've got to remember that in the 70s, up to the 70s, Israel was a kind of semi-socialist state, really, governed long-term by the Labor Party. Hawke and many Labor people had close connections with Labor politicians in Israel, with the trade union movement. And they saw the kibbutz movement as a kind of experiment in socialist living. But even post that, even when Begin was elected, and that was a big change in Israeli politics, you know, the Likud had been elected for the first time, Hawke remained a staunch supporter of Israel and of Jews. I mean, it's important to understand that he had an emotional attachment to Jewish people. Some of them he knew from his private life, some of them had been mentors for him. But he had this, look, I can remember sitting in a car with Bob Hawke once when I was doing a story about him, the first challenge to Hayden's leadership, sitting in a car with Bob Hawke. I was driving him around, actually. He thought I was working for him. But he's sitting in the back seat and crying about the Holocaust and what had happened to Jews. I mean, I know Bob Hawke had a tendency to cry at the drop of a hat, but it was genuine. It was real. There has been no Labor leader like him since then. And what has happened, of course, is that within the left and in sections of the Labor Party, especially the left of the Labor Party, but now spread far beyond the left of the Labor Party, there is no love for Israel.
No.
There is kind of grudging support. And I think that the last Labor leader that had genuine affection for Israel was our only female Prime Minister.
Mm-hmm.
I think Gillard had genuine affection for Israel and genuine affection for Jewish people.
Mm.
She's the last of them, really the last of them.
Your book, My Life as a Jew, was released just before October 7, and you wrote about your experiences with falling out with your fellow left-wing travellers. But I think for most other people in Australia, it felt sudden, the rise of anti-Semitism after October 7. Were you surprised or?
No, I wasn't surprised. I was surprised about the extent of it, but I could see it happening on the left. Israel had been demonised and Zionism had been. And once that happened, it was inevitable that there would be this. It would be disguised as anti-Zionism, but what it was, and it was at the beginning, it was hostility to Jews, and post-October the 7th, it developed into hatred of Jews. I don't like the term anti-Semitism because it's contested, because what is it? I mean, people find it hard to understand what it is, but I can tell you what it is simply. It's hatred of Jews. It's hatred of Jewish people. It is about seeing Jews as demonic. The small minority of people can control the whole of the world, politics, the media, business, everything.
So there has been a lot of debate, Michael, about why is anti-Semitism different from Islamophobia?
I was part of a program by the ABC a week ago where they gathered these, 7 Jewish people to talk about what it meant to be a Jew and what it meant to be the subject of anti-Semitism. And at the end of these Jewish people talking about really terrible experiences that they had had, the Race Discrimination Commissioner was there.
Oh, yes.
He was asked, what did he think about this? And he said, well, anti-Semitism is we are a racist society and there's all sorts of racism. And, if you look at the progression here, what there's been, there was anti-Asian racism during COVID, then the anti-Indigenous racism, then there was Indian racism, anti-Indian racism, and now it's the Jews' turn. Well, I mean, this was outrageous, what he was saying, as if they're all the same and the consequences are all the same. I mean, 15 people had just been massacred in Bondi because they were Jews. There have been no massacres of Indians. There have been no massacres of Muslims. He actually mentioned anti-Palestinian racism. What is that? I don't even know what anti-Palestinian racism is and who suffers from it. Has there been violence against any of these people? The way there has been violence for 2.5 years against Jews. So I think they are different. And when you look at reports on Islamophobia, the envoy for Islamophobia could point to hardly a single incident of violence against Muslim people. There were insults hurled at Muslim women in hijabs, and that's awful. That is terrible. But nothing organised. Where are the protests outside of prayer centres of Muslims like there were outside of synagogues? Where are the Muslim schools that need guards and security outside them? There isn't a Jewish institution in Australia that doesn't need guards. It's normalised. We can't go to an event. Jews can't go to an event where there won't be guards and where they will know before the day of the event where that event is going to be held. So this idea that they're equivalent somehow, I mean, that is designed to minimise what Jews are going through in Australia. The people who make that claim, and Australian politicians, Labor government members made that claim until recently. They've stopped doing it. Post-October the 7th, they've stopped doing it. But they all did it. Albanese, Burke, they all did it. And it was designed to say it's the same as the people that I represent in those Western cities. They're going through the same sort of things, which was never true, which doesn't mean there isn't Islamophobia. I mean, there's all kinds of prejudices.
Meaning that our Race Discrimination Commissioner would come out with a statement that Australia is a
captured. It's an
country.
Ideology.
There may be racist people in Australia,
yes,
but to suggest that a whole country is in and of itself racist is an extraordinary claim.
All these institutions have been captured.
Yeah.
They believe in that ideology. They believe that racism is institutionalised, and you have to change the institutions. However, I don't even know what that means to deal with it. And they accept the idea.
Well, I think what it means is something quite terrifying.
Yes, exactly. I don't want to spell it out.
Yeah.
But I do think our institutions have been captured. I think much of our universities have been captured by this ideology. I think that's true.
Now, Michael, we've reached the open Q&A time, so I should go to audience questions. First question from Stephen Wilkes. Hello, Stephen. He's an academic at ANU. Thanks, Georgina and Michael. Carelessly naive as most of the 2024 uni campus protesters were, do you think that their actions were pivotal in sparking the emergence of more virulent anti-Semitism in Australia?
Yes, I do think that. I think that the size of them, the way many of the protesters treated Jewish students, definitely normalised on campuses to begin with a kind of hostility to Jews that hadn't existed before. There was Israel Apartheid Week, but it was a kind of minor, you could ignore it. I thought it was ridiculous, but I thought, well, okay.
Well, and I mean, I can even give you really contemporary examples. I started working in this job in 2021 and, there were regular pro-PAL stands in the South Lawn, which we're just looking over there. That was a regular part of socialist programming, if you like. But in 2024, when they set up camps here, it's hard, I think, for people just to have seen it briefly on the news to really appreciate how intimidating it is to have 100, 200 people camped, not just sitting there all day, camped there. And every time you're walking into work, you're walking away. They are hounding you, really, really aggressive community that no one here could ignore, that was frightening for people who they were targeting.
Yes, and I think that there were instances of, student meetings where Jews tried to speak and people turned their back on them or shut them up and wouldn't listen. I mean, to turn your back on fellow students seems to me to be, something that is not acceptable. And what's also not acceptable, what I haven't seen before, is academics taking part in these sort of protests and taking part of them in their classrooms, where there are Jewish students sitting there who were thinking, what am I meant to do about this?
It seemed to me to have a contagion effect, didn't it? And there was permissiveness in, the more protests, the more people felt they could.
Some of the people who protested here organised the protests on the streets. And I don't know how many people have gone to, I have, the protests are not peaceful. It's not true that they're peaceful. It is true that a lot of people go there because they feel terrible about what's happening in Gaza, and I accept that. Of course they do. But the leaders of the protests, the people organising the protests, the voices of the protests, they're not peaceful. They're violent. They are violent. The signs are violent. They're full of hatred for Jews. Now, that has become normalised. It started at the universities and it is now out there, or was out there, and still is to a certain extent, in our streets. Social media is full of it now.
I have a question from another Canberra resident, Dave Windsor. Thanks, Dave. He said the focus on Australia is entirely proper and correct, but he'd be interested in Mr. Gawenda's thoughts on parallels with other countries' left-wing shifts away from Israel. For example, the post-Biden Democrats and the rise we've all been seeing in appalling attacks against Jewish communities.
Well, I think it is true that there is this sort of growth in this sort of anti-Zionist, anti-Israel Jew hatred around the world, in Europe and certainly in the United States. But I think Australia and Canada, for that matter, have a much more virulent form of it,
right,
which stems from the fact that on the left, they see Australia as a colonialist country that has either wiped out the Indigenous people or oppressed them, taken over the country, living on stolen land. And the same is true in Canada, the same sort of movement. I mean, Henry Reynolds is one of the great historians, whether you agree with him or not, on Indigenous history. He has become a full-on anti-Israel historian who believes Israel is an evil and an example of what happens in a colonial society like Australia. You can hear it in the slogans here and in Canada. We're living on stolen ground. The Israelis have stolen.
So you don't see that in the United States
not
so
the
much,
same, no.
or the UK?
No, the left doesn't quite see itself in America the same way as an anti-colonial society. They are much more concerned about being a racist society than they are colonialist, even though they are, of course. And in the UK, I mean, the UK can't be seen as a colonial entity, nation. In fact, England was subject to colonialism over the many centuries that it existed, taken over by Normans, taken over by all sorts of people. Who were the indigenous people of England? I mean, people couldn't say who they were. But nevertheless, it is different. It is different. And I think in Australia, I mean, Canada, I think, has even a bigger problem with Jew hatred than Australia. In Canada, there are shootings at synagogues. What we have unfortunately become in the world known for is the December 14th massacre of Jews, the largest massacre of Jews in the diaspora in some ways since the Second World War. I mean, Australia has become, we can't help it, a country where there was a terrorist massacre of Jews. And that's why around the world we are seen that way increasingly. And we have to deal with that because it's not true for a start. The vast majority of Australians aren't Jew haters. This country still remains in many ways a great place for Jewish people. But I do think that in the culture, in the elites, there's a virus. There's an unhingedness.
Well, this question from Sam Belfield, thanks Sam, probably relates to the point. Does Michael have a view on why the institutions have been captured by Jew hatred? And we've seen, Writers' Weeks, festivals. I mean, the Sydney Biennale's been caught up in some terrible programming decisions just over the last. So, this sort of idea that it's institutional. Mainstream Australians may not have any truck with this, but the institutions have a.
Well, I think it's true. I think. Look, why? I think it did start with the universities. I do think that the people who ran universities couldn't get their heads around what is Jew hatred? Why is this happening? Is it okay that it's happening? Look, I've spoken, not recently, I think they've changed their positions, but I've spoken to vice-chancellors that really didn't know how this had come about. It didn't even know what did anti-Zionism actually mean. When I asked them, what do you think anti-Zionists are actually saying? They didn't know. They thought they were just opposed to Israeli policies. Well, that's just not true.
A question probably coming from another perspective here from James Gray. Thank you, James. Does Michael have empathy for Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank? Does he support a two-state solution?
Oh, look, I'll tell you why this is a difficult question.
Sure.
If there were demonstrations in Australia, sometime, not at the beginning, I wouldn't have. If there had been demonstrations in Australia that were in favour of a two-state solution, that were concerned about the lives of the Palestinians in Gaza, like I am, and what was going on in the West Bank, which I think is shocking in many ways, I would have been out there marching. And many Jews like me would have been out there marching. But the fact is, from the start, we were excluded. We couldn't do that. You know, how was I to go? How would Jews like me possibly be able to go to that demonstration at the Opera House on the 9th before anything had happened? Yes, there'd been a day of bombing by the Israelis, but that's all at that stage. How could I go to a demonstration like that where there were, okay, maybe they didn't, they certainly said, can I say a rude, they certainly was shouting, fuck the Jews. Most people don't know where the Jews come from. Where the Jews comes from, when the Nazis came to ghettos to round up Jews for transportation to death camps, they would shout, where are the Jews? So, yes, I found it really hard. To be critical of what was happening because I was overwhelmed by this sense of hatred towards Israel, towards Jews, towards people like me. But I did write about it. I did write. I think that what has happened in Gaza is appalling, shocking. The responsibility is not just Israel's. The responsibility is the leadership of the Palestinians as well. There is enough responsibility to go around. I also think it's possible to argue that the war went on too long, that it wasn't achieving much after the first year. I wrote about this. I wrote these things. How could any decent human being not look at, read about some of the things that have happened to the people of Gaza without feeling deeply hurt by it, deeply concerned about it? But this accusation that I am somehow responsible for what the Israeli government has done in Gaza, that I am a genocide supporter, that I am as much responsible as the government of Israel for what is happening in Gaza, I mean, this is an outrage. The sense that if I disagree, which I do, that what happened in Gaza is not genocide, then I am an apologist for genocide. I am a supporter of Nazis. So it has become impossible to support a two-state solution publicly, to sympathise and feel deep hurt for what has happened in Gaza without being accused of not telling the truth, of using their pain to further my goal, which is to support Zionism. I mean, it has become unhinged. There is no debate with some people.
No, yes.
But even people who I think are not that far gone, it is impossible sometimes to hear them speak and not think, what world do you live in? You know, there are people who have said to me, people who I think are perfectly sane, the 15 people who were killed, some of them supported the genocide in Israel actively, right? Not that we're saying they deserve to be killed. They didn't deserve to be killed, but they deserve to be tried in a court for supporting I mean, there is a sort of madness abroad that really is dangerous. Whether the Royal Commission can deal with this, I don't know. I haven't got great faith that it can.
Well, a question here, perhaps with a bit more of an uplifting response, I hope, from Ross. Thanks, Ross. How do we as a collective change the narrative to again become the Golden Land? And there is a Yiddish expression for this, but my Yiddish was, I wasn't...
The Golden Land?
Yes, Golden Medina.
Golden and Medina.
Golden and Medina, thank you.
Golden and Medina actually translate Golden State, and Medina is a state. And it was first used by Jewish migrants at the turn of the 19th century to America, right? But the Jews that came here took it up and said, we're actually the Golden State. We live in the Golden State. And how will that change? I think with time. I think that there are enough people in the elites Australian public doesn't want any of this, I don't believe. But there are enough people in the political class, and I think that includes some Labor politicians, but certainly on the Conservative side, I think there are enough people at the universities, including administrators of universities, that believe what happened last year went too far and they're not prepared to accept that anymore. I think that there is a sense, this will take time, this will take time. I think that because I believe at root Australia still remains a wonderful place for Jews. I mean, how can I not? I came from being a 2-year-old refugee from a DP camp to having a role in public life in Australia where no one questioned it in the main. No one said, I couldn't be that. No one said anything. How could I not believe that Australia remains that place? We just have to find a way of countering what is really a small minority of people who have captured some of the elite positions in the culture at universities. And I think that can be done. We need brave politicians.
Yeah, and brave cultural leaders too.
And brave culture. I mean, I am most disappointed in the fact that cultural leaders who run writers' institutes, who run cultural institutions, who run whatever it is, the replacement of the Australia Council, how cowardly they've been, how unable they've been to call some of this out. Young Australian Jewish artists being cancelled, can't get gigs. Why has Tony Burke not said something about that?
Michael, what about Writers' Week? Invitation was rescinded by the board, and then board sacked or board resigned, new board put in, Writers' Week cancelled, and then invitation extended to the previously uninvited author to appear in the next Writers' Week. And then a guerrilla Writers' Week comes about and she's invited and really headlined with the now former director of Writers' Week. I mean, it's actually so confusing in the description of it, but you know the story. I mean, what was your view on the whole debacle?
I don't believe. I thought it was a mistake to cancel her, to force her withdrawal from the festival. I'll tell you why. Not because I think she's great. I think she's dangerous, actually. I think she's dangerous to Jews. The problem was their explanation for why they cancelled her. They cancelled her because of Jewish sensitivities at a time like this, post December the 14th. Wrong reason. Jews don't need to be singled out in this way. It wasn't about Jews. It was about, is this the sort of person you should have at a Writers' Festival? I think it would have been all right to have her, right? As long as there was balance, as long as there were people there that could balance the festival. I often argued with Louise Adler, who was she was a friend once, to have me at the festival. Let's have me with her, with Louise. We'd have a great audience talking about anti-Zionism and what it meant. I mean, Louise Adler is one of the great figures in Australian literary culture. She is an out-and-out anti-Zionist, open about it, organised about it. So what sort of festival do you think she's going to produce? And what influence does she have on other festivals? I mean, it's a small band of people, these people that organise these festivals.
Yeah. And they're gatekeepers.
And they're gatekeepers.
Yeah.
So, yes, they can point to Jews they've invited, but most of them are anti-Zionists. I mean, it's as if invite a Jew and everything's okay, right? What they believe, what they advocate for, that doesn't matter.
Well, it does matter.
Well, of course
it needs to suit a certain narrative. A question from Michelle Keys. Thanks, Michelle. Does Michael have a view about the Islamist propaganda permeating Australia that is cloaked in faux outrage about Palestine?
Well, this is a good question. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I do believe that the pro-Palestinian movement and the people on the left that support it were organised long before October the 7th. And a bit of that is in my book. They were organised. When you think about...
And resourced.
And resourced.
Yeah.
I'm not saying the resources came from overseas, but they were resourced. I mean, there is, of course, evidence that some of those kind of like Qatar do fund university programs and whatever, but they were resourced, they were ready. You know, the tents at all the encampments were the same. They'd been bought at the same place, got ready at the same place. If you look at when the group letters started by journalists and by academics, they started the day after October the 7th. Overland published its now notorious letter calling it Resistance. And that was organised beforehand. So I do think it's an organised movement, well organised, good media people who know how to use the media, and there's enough of them. I mean, you know, people talk about the power of the Jewish lobby. The Jews do not have the sort of political power that the pro-Palestinian movement has got. They didn't know it until October the 7th. They thought they were powerful.
2 minutes left, and this is a massive question, so a mean one to end on, sorry. From Michelle Smith, thanks for your talk. Would you like to speculate on what might be the outcome of the war in Iran? Something simple to end on, Michael.
Yeah, what will be the outcome of the war in Iran? Gee, I don't know what the outcome of the war in Iran will be. I fear for the outcome of that war. I fear that it's a more difficult war than either Trump or Netanyahu imagined it would be. So I fear for the outcome. I do. I don't know what it'll be. If the Israelis had the ability to decide how it would end, they would keep going until there was a regime change of some sort in Iran. How they would do that, I don't know. But the chances are they won't be able to do that. But what is appalling to me is that amongst those people who were most concerned about what was happening in Gaza and what was happening in the West Bank, and there's virtually no concern about what was happening in Iran.
30,000 protesters killed in 2 weeks. Yeah.
How is that possible? These people are now out protesting against the war while people from Iran are marching beside them saying, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
You know, I'm Iranian. Ask me what's going on there.
Yeah. No, indeed. Michael Gawenda, thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light Live. It's been a really important discussion, and I know our audience, seeing all the comments we're getting, really appreciated it. So thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.